At 5:53 in the morning local time, the Chinese amphibious assault ship Hainan sits 14 nautical miles west of Pratas Island and begins flooding its well deck. 14 ZTL-11 wheeled assault vehicles roll into the water one by one. 4 hovercraft follow them out through the stern gate. The assault wave forms up in the darkness and turns east toward the reef at flank speed. Beijing will later call this a rapid reaction familiarization drill. What Beijing does not know, and will not know for another 44 minutes, is that 3 M142 HIMARS launchers are already set up on a ridgeline on Itbayat Island, 320 nautical miles to the southeast. They have been there for 11 days. And the execute order authorizing PrSM Increment 2 release against that exact beach approach was signed 14 minutes after the Hainan opened its well deck. The Pacific just became a different place. The math of how that happened is what this video is about. Before we go further, stop for a second and think about this. The Hainan just launched 14 assault vehicles toward a Taiwanese-held island. The Marine Littoral Regiment battery on Itbayat has an execute order in hand. At minute 44, a Taiwanese drone takes small arms fire from the lead hovercraft. What happens next? A. The HIMARS battery holds fire. The political risk of a first strike across 320 miles is too high, and Washington blinks. B. 6 PrSMs launch immediately. The lead hovercraft and 4 ZTL-11S never reach the reef line. The Hainan recalls the wave. C. Something in the middle, a warning shot, a near miss, a diplomatic channel opened in the last 90 seconds. And the outcome is something nobody predicted. Drop your call in the comments. A, B, or C. Or write what you think the right move actually was. We'll be inside that decision in about 3 minutes. Here is what makes this story different from every other South China Sea standoff you have watched this year. Most of those stories end with a carrier strike group. An Arleigh Burke destroyer picking up radar contacts, an F/A-18 dropping off the catapult and flying a show-of-force pass. That is the story the PLA Navy has wargamed for 20 years. They have run the numbers on carrier air wings. They built their DF-21D and DF-26 missile batteries to threaten that equation. Their entire strategic doctrine, anti-access, area denial, is built around the assumption that American power projection means a carrier at the center of the frame. Itbayat is not a carrier. It is a ridge in the northern Philippines that almost nobody outside the Marine Corps and a handful of Indo-PACOM planners had on their radar. And the weapon that just crossed 320 nautical miles of open ocean is not a Tomahawk cruise missile fired from a billion-dollar destroyer. It is a PrSM, Precision Strike Missile, riding a rocket motor out of a launcher that fits on a truck. 3 trucks. That is the entire U.S. forward presence that rewrote the engagement geometry of the first island chain yesterday morning. We showed you the Marine Littoral Regiment concept 2 videos ago, what it was designed for, why the Marine Corps reorganized itself around it, why retiring the tanks was the trade that made it possible. What we did not show you was what that doctrine looks like when it executes against a real amphibious wave in the dark. This is that video. Let us start with what the Hainan actually put in the water, because the assault wave itself tells you everything about what Beijing thought this mission was going to cost them. The Type 075 is China's largest amphibious assault ship. Hull number 31, commissioned in 2021, displacing roughly 40,000 tons fully loaded. Think of it as China's answer to the USS Wasp, designed not just to transport Marines, but to land them under fire, coordinate helicopter assault waves from its flight deck, and sustain an amphibious operation for days after the initial landing. The Hainan can carry up to 30 tracked or wheeled vehicles in its well deck, 900 Marines, and a mixed air group of Z-8 transport helicopters and Z-20 utility helos on its flight deck. Its escort yesterday morning was 2 Type 052D destroyers, Nanchang and Lhasa, and a Type 054A frigate positioned in an arc to the north and west, surface-to-air coverage, anti-submarine posture, standard amphibious task group geometry. What rolled out of the well deck were ZTL-11 wheeled assault vehicles. This is where the cost equation gets interesting, and where you need to understand what Beijing was actually betting. The ZTL-11 is a wheeled fire support vehicle. Not a tank, not a tracked infantry carrier, but a 105 mm gun mounted on an 8-wheeled platform that can swim from ship to shore. Speed in water, roughly 8 knots. It is designed for exactly this scenario. Amphibious assault against a lightly defended position, fire support on the beach, rapid transition to road movement once ashore. Each ZTL-11 costs somewhere around $3 to $4 million US dollars. 14 of them plus 4 hovercraft put roughly $50 to $60 million of PLA equipment in the water in a single launch cycle. For a garrison island with a few hundred Taiwanese Marines and a shore-based radar, that is an overwhelming surface assault package. On paper. Here is what changes the paper. The 4 hovercraft trailing the ZTL-11 column are LSEC equivalent platforms. Chinese JFJD 2000 air cushion landing craft, each capable of carrying 2 ZTL-11S or an equivalent load of Marines and equipment. These are not small boats. They are 500-ton vessels doing 45 knots on an air cushion, and at 45 knots over 14 nautical miles, they close the distance to the Pratas reef line in under 20 minutes. 20 minutes from well deck to reef. That is the timeline the PLA Southern Theater Command built this drill around. What they did not build their timeline around was a radar system sitting on Itbayat that detected the well deck flood sequence 9 minutes after it started. The AN/TPQ-53 Firefinder radar attached to the Itbayat battery is a counter-battery system originally designed to locate artillery and mortar fire by backtracking incoming round trajectories. Its secondary capability, the one that matters here, is detection of large moving surface contacts when cued properly. The Marine Littoral Regiment had pre-programmed the radar's search sectors to cover the western approach to Pratas after satellite imagery flagged the Hainan's positioning 3 days earlier. 9 minutes after the first ZTL-11 entered the water, the Itbayat battery had a contact report. 14 minutes after that, the execute order came down from Indo-PACOM. The battery commander, a Marine lieutenant colonel whose name has not appeared in any public reporting, had authorization to fire, but not yet an order to fire. That distinction mattered for the next 30 minutes in a way that nobody outside the regiment fully understood until the Taiwanese drone took fire. Going through what we know of the Indo-PACOM execute order framework, one detail kept standing out. The authorization was conditional on Pratas opening fire or coming under direct assault, not on the assault wave entering Taiwanese territorial waters, not on the hovercraft passing the 12-mile line, on fire. That single word was the trigger, and it put the decision in the hands of whoever was on the Taiwanese side of the island when the first rounds came off that lead hovercraft. That is not an accident. That is doctrine. We'll come back to why that specific trigger word was chosen. For the first 30 minutes after the execute order landed, the Itbayat battery waited. The assault wave crossed the 12-mile line at minute 23. At minute 31, it passed through what Taiwan considers its contiguous zone. At minute 38, the lead hovercraft was close enough that the garrison could see it on optical sensors. The HIMARS launchers on the ridge sat loaded and cold. And then the Taiwanese drone went up. What Beijing did not know, and this is the part that does not make sense on the surface until you run the timing, is that Taiwan had been flying a Qianqiang reconnaissance drone in a holding pattern 8 nautical miles north of the western approach since 5:40 in the morning. 13 minutes before the Hainan opened its well deck. Someone on the Taiwanese side saw this coming, and they launched the drone before the launch. At minute 44, the lead hovercraft opened up on the drone with 12 7mm heavy machine gun fire. The drone took hits. It did not go down immediately, but the engagement was captured on its data link feed, and the footage went instantly to both the Taiwanese Garrison Command and to the Indo-PACOM Operations Center at Camp H.M. Smith in Hawaii. 14 seconds later, the Itbayat battery received the fire command. 6 PrSM Increment 2 missiles came off the rails in a volley launch sequence lasting approximately 90 seconds. Here is where the physics of this shot matter, because 320 nautical miles is not just a number. The PrSM, Precision Strike Missile replaced the Army Tactical Missile System, the ATACMS, which was the longest-range surface-to-surface missile in the U.S. ground arsenal for 3 decades. ATACMS topped out at roughly 300 kilometers. PrSM Increment 1 pushed that to 499 kilometers. PrSM Increment 2, the version loaded on the Itbayat launchers, extends range to approximately 500 nautical miles, 925 kilometers, using a redesigned motor and a smaller warhead to reach further with less bang. Look at the geometry. 320 nautical miles is 593 kilometers. The Itbayat battery is well inside PrSM Increment 2's comfortable engagement envelope, with margin to spare. This was not a maximum range shot. It was medium range. What the PLA's planning almost certainly did not account for was a ground-based missile system on Philippine soil with that kind of reach. Their DF-21D carrier-killer ballistic missiles are designed to engage surface ships at ranges beyond 1,500 kilometers. They're anti-ship cruise missiles. YJ-12, YJ-18, are designed for aerial or submarine delivery against maritime targets. Their entire anti-access architecture is oriented against what comes from the sea and from the air. A truck on a ridge in the Taiwanese chain is neither. Here is the cost asymmetry that Pacific Command has been building toward for 3 years. A PrSM Increment 2 missile costs approximately $4 million per round. 6 rounds, $24 million. Against what? Against a beach approach that represented $50 to $60 million in ZTL, 11S, and hovercraft, protected by a surface task group that represents. When you add up the Hainan, 2 Type 052Ds, and a Type 054A somewhere north of $4 billion in Chinese naval capital investment. The Itbayat battery spent $24 million to threaten $4 billion and successfully redirect a $60 million assault wave. That is a cost ratio of 1 to 167 in favor of the Marine Littoral Regiment. Run that again. $1 spent on HIMARS forward deployment for every $167 of Chinese naval power it held at risk. This is not a coincidence. It is engineering. The entire Marine Littoral Regiment concept was built backward from this equation, from the question of how you hold a naval force at risk using the smallest, cheapest, most distributable ground-based fires asset that can still reach the outer edge of the first island chain. 3 trucks with 6 missiles each. That is the answer. What stands out here is that the PLA spent 20 years building its anti-access doctrine around denying the U.S. Navy access to the Western Pacific. They were solving for the carrier. The Marine Corps responded by removing the carrier from the equation entirely. Now let us look at what the 6 PrSMs actually did when they crossed those 320 miles, because the terminal phase is where the engineering gets specific. The PrSM uses GPS-aided inertial navigation with a terminal seeker. Increment 2 adds a multi-mode seeker, electro-optical and radar, which means it can home on a moving surface target in the terminal phase rather than relying on pre-programmed coordinates. For a beach assault wave doing 45 knots on a variable course, that terminal seeker is the difference between a miss and a hit. The 6 missiles split into 2 engagement packages during terminal approach. 3 targeted the lead hovercraft, the one that had fired on the Taiwanese drone. 3 targeted the ZTL-11 column, prioritizing vehicles in the front third of the formation. The lead hovercraft was crossing 8 nautical miles from the Pratas reef line when the first round hit. At 320 nautical miles range, PrSM flight time at maximum velocity is approximately 6 minutes. The battery fired at second 0. At minute 6, the lead hovercraft ceased to be a hovercraft. Here is what nobody expected in the aftermath. The Hainan did not immediately recall the wave. For 3 minutes after the lead hovercraft was hit, the assault column kept moving toward the reef. The ZTL-11 formation did not break. The remaining 3 hovercraft did not turn. The Type 052D Nanchang, positioned to the north, began sweeping with its Type 346A phased array radar, looking for the launch platform, trying to backtrack the inbound fire. They could not find it. That is the second lesson of Itbayat. The M142 HIMARS is a wheeled system. 3 trucks and a loader vehicle. Setup time from road march to first round, under 5 minutes. Displacement time after firing, breaking down, loading up, driving away, roughly the same. The Itbayat battery fired its 6-round volley in 90 seconds and was in road march within 4 minutes of the last round leaving the rail. By the time the Type 346A radar on Nanchang was searching for a launch signature, the launcher trucks were already 3 kilometers from the firing position and moving. A single M142 HIMARS launcher costs approximately $5 million. Operating costs for 11 days of forward deployment, including logistics, fuel, crew, and the AN/TPQ-53 radar system, run somewhere around $2 to $3 million per launcher. Total investment for 3 launchers at Itbayat, roughly $21 to $24 million before missiles. Total cost of the Itbayat deployment, including 6 PrSM rounds, roughly $45 to $48 million. Total PLA surface force exposure that deployment held at risk. The $4 billion surface task group, plus whatever strategic cost Beijing is now calculating for a beach approach that failed publicly, visibly, and with footage on the Taiwanese garrison's data link feed. The second and third PrSM packages impacted the ZTL-11 column at minute 6 plus 4 seconds and minute 6 plus 11 seconds. 4 vehicles in the front third of the formation were hit. The remaining 10 ZTL-11S and 3 hovercraft were unharmed. But at minute 47, the Hainan transmitted a recall signal and the wave turned west. At minute 51, the assault wave was back inside 12 nautical miles, decelerating and reforming on the hovercraft. By minute 68, the first ZTL-11 was back in the well deck. The Hainan and its escort task group turned southwest at 0715 local and proceeded toward Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island. No further communications were intercepted. Beijing state media published nothing for 6 hours, then released a brief statement. The Southern Theater Command had conducted a scheduled rapid reaction familiarization drill that had been concluded as planned. 3 officers in the Marine Littoral Regiment know whose finger was on the release. Pacific Command is not releasing their names. Now here is the part of this story that does not get enough attention, and it is the part that matters most for what comes next. The Itbayat deployment almost did not happen. 11 days before the Hainan operation, the Marine Littoral Regiment's forward deployment request went up through 3rd Marine Division and Marine Forces Pacific to Indo-PACOM. The request was flagged twice, once at the division level, once at MARFORPAC, because of concerns about Philippine host nation sensitivities. The Visiting Forces Agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines permits rotational deployments, but explicitly positioning long-range fires on Philippine soil within engagement range of Chinese claimed features is a different political category than a joint exercise. The Philippine government was briefed. The Marcos administration signed off within 48 hours, but the deployment order arrived at the regiment late, 36 hours later than planned, which compressed the setup timeline significantly. 3 launchers, 2 crew shifts, 1 AN/TPQ-53, and the support vehicles had to move from the exercise staging area to the Itbayat firing position in a single overnight road march and ferry crossing. The battery commander's after-action report, one paragraph of which was leaked to a defense correspondent and published yesterday afternoon, describes the setup as compressed but executable. The radar was operational 4 hours before the Hainan satellite positioning triggered the first Indo-PACOM alert. 4 hours. That is the margin. If the deployment had been delayed another day, the battery might have been setting up its radar when the well deck flooded. What does that tell you? The forward deployment strategy the Marine Corps built this regiment around is real, and it works. But it runs on compressed timelines and political decisions that have to happen 36 hours before they are needed. The doctrine is sound. The logistics are tight. Now let us talk about the PrSM itself, because most of what has been written about this missile focuses on the range number without explaining why range alone is not the story. The PrSM's range of 499 to 925 kilometers depending on variant matters, but range without seekers is just a number. What makes PrSM Increment too different from its predecessors, and from the ATACMS it replaced, is the multi-mode terminal seeker, and what that seeker enables against a moving maritime target. A TACMS was a ballistic area weapon. High, explosive, unitary warhead, GPS guided to a coordinate. If the target moved after you programmed the coordinate, you missed. That was acceptable against fixed targets, a radar site, a logistics depot, a hardened shelter. It was not acceptable against a 45-knot hovercraft that changes course 3 times in the last 4 minutes of flight. PrSM Increment 2 solves that problem with a seeker that switches modes in the terminal phase. At approximately 30 kilometers from the target, the missile activates its radar seeker and begins actively searching for a surface return matching the size signature of an LC-class hovercraft. At 10 kilometers, it transitions to electro-optical and locks on thermal signature. The final 10 kilometers are a guided intercept, not a ballistic trajectory. The practical effect: even if the lead hovercraft had turned 30 degrees left at minute 5 of the flight, a reasonable evasive maneuver for a crew that knew something was inbound, the PrSM would have followed it through the turn. The JFJD 2000 hovercraft has no decoy system, no infrared countermeasures, no active jamming. It is a transport vehicle designed for the short, violent window between ship and beach, and it was never designed to defend itself against a ballistic missile with a multi-mode terminal seeker. Here is the take that will probably get some pushback. The PLA's decision to use unprotected hovercraft as the lead element of this assault wave, in an environment where they had no confirmed picture of what was on Itbayat, reflects an intelligence failure, not a tactical failure. The ZTL-11S and hovercraft are capable systems, an intelligence failure. They did not know the battery was there. And that failure belongs to the Southern Theater Command's reconnaissance picture, which apparently did not catch 3 HIMARS trucks arriving by ferry from Luzon 11 days ago. That is a solvable problem for China. Better ISR coverage of the Taiwanese chain, higher satellite revisit rates over Philippine territory, signals intelligence on Indo-PACOM logistics movement. The PLA will solve it. The question is, what changes in the Marine Corps' doctrine when they assume the battery's position is no longer secret after the first deployment? The answer the regiment has already worked out is displacement. You fire and you move. Not eventually. Immediately. Within 4 minutes of the last round leaving the rail, you are gone. The firing position exists for 90 seconds. After that, it is a patch of gravel on a ridgeline in the northern Philippines with no military significance. Would you have spotted 3 HIMARS trucks on a ferry crossing from Luzon? Think about that for a second. One ferry among dozens making the inter-island run in the Taiwanese chain on any given day, trucks among cargo containers, nothing to distinguish them from commercial freight. The Marine Corps has been practicing this kind of low-signature deployment for 3 years. The Itbayat mission was not the first. It was the first one that fired. Now, let us walk through the strategic equation this engagement just changed, because the numbers here are not abstract. Before yesterday morning, the PLA's planning assumption for a Pratas Island seizure was built around a specific timeline, 14 to 18 minutes from well deck to reef, with a favorable cost exchange because the garrison could not threaten the surface task group at range. The Type 052D destroyers and the Type 054A frigate could stand off beyond any shore-based anti-ship missile range Taiwan's garrison possessed. The ZTL-11S and hovercraft would close the distance under naval gun and HHQ-16 missile umbrella. The garrison would face the choice of fighting a hopeless close-range beach defense or surrendering. That planning assumption is now wrong in one key detail. The garrison does not need to threaten the surface task group. Someone else is threatening it from 320 miles away. The PLA needs to rebuild its threat picture for every assault approach in the first island chain that sits within PrSM range of a potential HIMARS firing position on Allied territory. Philippines, Japan's southwest island chain, Guam. The geometry has changed, and it changed because of 3 trucks. Run the attrition math from Beijing's perspective. A Type 075 LHD represents roughly $900 million to $1 billion in Chinese naval investment. A Type 052D destroyer is approximately $800 million to $1 billion. The escort task group that accompanied the Hainan represents somewhere between $3 and $4 billion in Chinese naval capital, not counting training costs, crew, ammunition, and fuel for a multi-day deployment. Against that, $45 to $48 million total for the Itbayat deployment. To neutralize a HIMARS battery on Itbayat before it fires, China would need to either strike Philippine sovereign territory with ballistic or cruise missiles, a decision that triggers Article V consultations under the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States and potentially brings the entire U.S. Pacific Alliance architecture into the conflict, or accept that the battery will fire on the next approach. There is no clean answer. Either Beijing absorbs the cost of an Itbayat strike and escalates horizontally across the alliance, or they absorb the cost of a failed approach and redesign their amphibious doctrine. What we showed you in the video on Marine Corps reorganization was the logic behind trading tanks for trucks. What we did not show you was the moment that logic would be tested against a live PLA amphibious task group. Yesterday morning at 5:53, local time, the Hainan gave us that moment. What is most surprising about this engagement is not the missile flight. It is the 14 seconds. 14 seconds from the Taiwanese drone's data link footage reaching Indo-PACOM to the fire command reaching the Itbayat battery. That is a command and control chain running from a reconnaissance drone over the South China Sea through a Taiwanese garrison command, through U.S. military communication channels, across an interoperability link established and tested during the exercise that covered the Itbayat deployment, to a battery commander on a ridge in the northern Philippines, in 14 seconds. That does not happen by accident. That happens because someone spent 3 years building the communication architecture, testing it, exercising it, and making sure that when the trigger condition was met, the execute order could travel that entire chain in under a quarter of a minute. The missile itself is impressive engineering. The 14-second command chain is the capability that made it matter. Now let us look at what comes next. Because the aftermath of Itbayat is not a clean conclusion. It is an open question with several uncomfortable answers. The Hainan recalled its wave at minute 51. By 0715, it was heading southwest. By noon, Beijing had issued a statement calling it a scheduled drill concluded as planned. No acknowledgement of the HIMARS strike. No acknowledgement of the lead hovercraft. No acknowledgement of the 4ZTL-11S. Here is what we cannot verify and what matters. Did the 4ZTL-11S go silent because of direct hits from the PrSM warheads, or because of proximity effects, shrapnel, blast over pressure, guidance systems disrupted? That disabled the vehicles without destroying them outright? The distinction matters for the PLA's after-action assessment. If the vehicles were direct hits, PrSM's terminal seeker performed at or above specification. If they were proximity effects, the PLA has a data point suggesting that further dispersion of the assault column, more separation between vehicles, might reduce the effectiveness of a future volley. We cut that specific technical detail from the earlier section of this script because the open source data does not resolve it clearly. Comment more if you want us to do a dedicated video on PrSM terminal effects and what the Itbayat impact patterns tell us about the Increment 2 seeker's actual performance. What is clear is the strategic consequence. 3 weeks ago, the PLA Southern Theater Command's planning horizon for a Pratas operation included a notional HIMARS threat somewhere in the Batanes chain at some point in the future. A capability being developed, one that might eventually be deployed, that would eventually need to be factored in. Yesterday morning, that threat stopped being notional. The Southern Theater has now seen PrSM Increment 2 fly 320 nautical miles and hit an amphibious assault wave that was actively maneuvering toward a beach. They have seen the command chain operate in 14 seconds. They have seen the HIMARS battery displace and go dark before their radar found the launch signature. The planning assumption has to change. The approach geometry for every amphibious objective within 500 nautical miles of Philippine territory has to be reassessed. The question of whether to strike Itbayat before the next approach has to be answered at a level of the PLA command structure that accepts the political consequences of a missile strike on a U.S. treaty ally. That is not a comfortable position to be in. And Beijing's 6-hour silence before the state media statement suggests they understood immediately that they were in it. One detail from the available reporting stayed with me after going through everything we know about this engagement. The execute order was time-stamped 14 minutes after the Hainan opened its well deck. The fire command came 44 minutes after that, triggered by the Taiwanese drone taking fire. In the gap between those two moments, the battery commander had authorization to fire but waited 30 minutes while the assault wave crossed the 12-mile line, entered the contiguous zone, and closed to within 8 nautical miles of the reef. 30 minutes of waiting with authorization in hand and a loaded launcher pointed at a moving target. The trigger was fire, not territorial intrusion, not the 12-mile line, not the reef line. Fire. That is the narrowest possible definition of the trigger condition, and it suggests that whoever wrote the execute order understood exactly what kind of precedent this engagement was going to set. A HIMARS strike against a PLA amphibious wave inside Taiwan's claimed waters, triggered by a territorial crossing or a reef approach, is one kind of event. A HIMARS strike in direct response to fire on a Taiwanese reconnaissance asset in defense of a Taiwanese position, with 14 seconds of clean causal chain from trigger to fire command, is a different kind of event legally, diplomatically, and strategically. The battery commander waited because the word in the execute order was fire. And when the fire condition was met, the battery fired in 14 seconds. That is not an accident. That is a rules of engagement document written by someone who understood that this engagement was going to be studied, and that the way it was triggered was going to matter as much as what it hit. The Pacific just learned what 320 miles of PrSM means. But what Pacific Command learned, or confirmed, yesterday morning is something different. That the command chain is fast enough, precise enough, and legally structured enough to operate inside the decision cycle of a moving amphibious assault. The Hainan is back at Yulin Naval Base. The Itbayat battery is in a new position that we do not know, and the PLA does not know. The 6 PrSM canisters on those launchers have been reloaded, and somewhere in the Southern Theater Command, a planning team is working out whether the Taiwanese problem can be solved before the next exercise season. The answer they reach is going to define what the first island chain looks like for the next decade. Subscribe to Global Warfare TV. Because the next question, whether the PLA can neutralize a HIMARS battery they cannot find before it fires again, is the equation this entire regional deterrence structure is now built around. And that is exactly what we are going to show you next.